But yeah, you kind of turn it the other way around, which is maybe we want the God to exist so that we have this better view about human rationality, which is interesting. I like that.
Well, I've been talking to too many epistemologists, I think, and
that's not possible.
That's awesome. Welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedicase, and this is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life, all the deepest questions with experts in those areas. I love thinking about cool stuff, and you're invited to come think with me. On this episode, we're going to be talking about an argument for God's existence, and particularly one that I did not like. I didn't like it at all, but people have been working on it a lot lately, and it's pretty interesting. So it's the argument from common consent, and sometimes you'll hear people say this is a logical fallacy and this and that, and I'm really excited to get into it with Dr. Jonathan Matheson. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of North Florida. And we were just talking about how Florida's weird. They say north instead of like northern. I went to Northern Illinois, right? But they have North Florida, South Florida. That's neither here nor there. I don't know if we're going to settle that debate here today. But we're going to be talking about common consent and why considering the amount of people who believe in God is evidence for God's existence. So we'll get into all that good stuff. Before we do, though, I want to thank everyone over on Patreon who's making this podcast happen. If this podcast is one of your favorites, top 5, even top 15, if you don't want to see this disappear and me, disappear off the map of YouTube, then please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can find a link in the description wherever you're getting this YouTube, wherever you're getting this podcast at. I'm having a hard time today. Please consider supporting it. This is brought to you by viewers like you. So without further ado, let's jump in and talk about common consent and the existence of God. John, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Happy to be here, Parker. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we just discovered beforehand that you're a TEDS grad as well. And so I was like, I knew I liked you for some reason. So can you regale us? Like, what'd you do your work on there at TEDS?
Yeah, it was a while ago. So I was there, I think 2000 to 2002. So to me, that still seems like it was like a couple of years ago, but according to the calendar, it's 20 years ago. So that's a long time. Yeah. Let's see. So I did a MA there in Christian thought. So I took pretty much every philosophy of religion class that I could take. So that's where I really actually got into epistemology. It was the first epistemology class I took was there. We read Warranted Christian Belief and a couple other kind of epistemological classics, and that got me hooked in. So from then on, it was all philosophy, all epistemology. So
wow, man. Well, so what'd you do after TEDS?
After there, I got married and then went to Madison, Wisconsin for a year, where my wife was getting her MSW, and then I got an MA in philosophy at Wisconsin, Milwaukee, just a little bit north of there.
Yeah.
And then from there, I went to get my PhD at University of Rochester.
Nice.
So I did that, and then ended up here in Jacksonville, and been here since.
Nice. So was your dissertational work in epistemology as well?
Yep. So I did my dissertation on the epistemic significance of disagreement. So thinking about, and it bears some relation to what we're going to talk about today with common consent, but again, it has to do with how other people's beliefs affect the rationality of your belief.
Yeah. Well, so something I picked up from your essay, and again, I should have said this earlier, folks. Sorry about that, but we're going to be discussing his paper in Contemporary Arguments in Natural Theology, the new book. Super expensive book, but really good book. Edited by Colin Ruloff and Peter Horben, I think is how you pronounce it. And so his argument, his chapter in there is the argument from common consent. And while I was reading this, you had talked about disagreement literature, so that makes sense that you did work on that. And you said, I did an episode on disagreement with my friend Nate Loffer. So if anyone doesn't know about that, you can go check that out. And I've learned that disagreement serves as evidence against your position if someone is your epistemic peer or whatever and disagrees with you. But you said agreement should also count as evidence. And I, for whatever reason, had never thought of that before. never heard that before, and it was really like illuminating. It blew my mind. I was in the coffee shop the other day. I was like, oh, okay, agreement should be able to help me if disagreement counts.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So I mean, I think uh, the significance of agreement's gotten a lot less attention
Hmm.
in epistemology than disagreement has.
Yeah.
But I think the very same considerations point to agreement carrying some epistemic weight. So what got me thinking about it was disagreement. So when Colin approached me about writing this essay, I actually hadn't really thought much about the common consent argument, but
Okay.
saw some connections to things I've been thinking about in terms of disagreement, and so that drew me into this argument, and so it was fun to think about it. Like as you said, this argument doesn't get very good publicity.
Yeah.
It could use some better PR. But what I found kind of fascinating about it is how it touches on so many big hot button issues in philosophy of religion. So
Yeah.
it was a lot of fun to think about for that reason as well.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting. So maybe we could just flesh out like what is the common consent argument. I talked about it a little bit the other day with my former professor and Ted's professor Harold Netland. He just kind of broached it in his new book on religious experience, and he's working on how we can
Okay.
use religious experience, how it might be used in a positive case for the existence of God. He mentioned it might be used in a common consent type argument, and so even since then, I've been more open to this argument, but it's basically like, if it's rational for you to believe in the existence of God because there are so many others who believe in the existence of God. Does that sound right, or do you want to flesh it out a little bit more than that? Just the summary core argument.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much it for like the basics. So the basic idea is that we gain a reason to believe that God exists based on so many other people's belief that God exists.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and so like you said, it does kind of sound like cheating a little bit, in part because it's not really thinking about what you might think is any direct reason to think that God exists. So it's not using reasons that are about God directly, but about other people and what other people think about whether God exists.
Yeah. Okay. So this is something that was new to me. Epistemology is so hard, dude.
I agree.
Analytic epistemology is just wild. Informal epistemology, all that stuff. So someone's evidence of evidence is evidence
Yeah,
is like a common thing.
that
If
was my dissertation advisor's slogan. So Richard Feldman, I think,
Oh, are you
was
serious?
the was the coiner of that
I didn't know
phrase.
you did it under Feldman. That's
Yeah.
insane, dude. Yeah, he like pretty much invented this whole thing with a single essay, right?
Yeah, so I consider myself a benefactor of some philosophical luck because I just kind of happened to. I mean, it just happened to go to Rochester. I wanted to work with Feldman and Earl Connie, but the disagreement stuff happened, or his essay kind of happened, and it kind of took off while I was there, and so I got to
Oh,
kind of
crazy.
get in on the topic right as it was kind of launching. So I think I owe a lot of where I ended up just to that sort of like accident of circumstance.
Yeah, holy cow, man. Yeah, I was gonna bring up Feldman. That's wild. So, when it comes to common consent, I do other people need to have the evidence, right? So you're collecting your evidence in the common consent is not direct evidence like you're talking about. It's not like facts. It's really just it's everyone else seems to have evidence or everyone else believes, and I'm taking that to be evidence. What if none of them had evidence? Would that destroy my evidence, or is it just the fact that so many people do believe? Do they actually have to have some kind of content that they're holding on to, some kind of fact, or does that not matter for the argument?
Good. Well, I think it's a little bit tricky. So I think it matters what it's rational for us to believe about those people. So if it was
Ah,
rational for us to believe that they believed it without any evidence,
mhm.
then I think the argument would be in trouble, right? Because their believing it wouldn't serve as any sort of reason, I think, for us to believe it. But in general, people believe things because they have reasons to believe it. Like that's,
Yeah.
I mean, humans have their cognitive flaws for sure, but in general, we tend to be rational creatures. And so when we believe something, we tend to have some evidence that it's true. And so, yeah, the idea here is that people's belief serves as like a placeholder or higher order evidence that there is this evidence out there, or that the correct way to evaluate that evidence is that it supports, in this case, God's existence.
Okay. Would it change if only one person had the actual like evidence and everyone else was relying on that one person's evidence? Sometimes you see this
Yeah.
in studies and they're flawed because they're all actually. I see this in turtle surveys and stuff. I'm kind of a turtle freak, and it's a weird thing. But if everyone's pulling from the same data and they're all purported, it's ballooning up, and it's like, well, they all came from the same thing, so that really messes with the survey. It was one person's work.
Good. Yeah. So I think there's a couple ways to disentangle that. So I think there's two ways you can think of it. So I think the fact that they're using the same set of data, that's not necessarily a problem, because I mean, one of the issues is how do we interpret the data, or what
Yeah.
does it support? And so finding out that multiple people interpret the data in the same way, I think strengthens our reason to think that that
Ah,
data does support what they take it to support,
okay.
right? So we're compare a case where you have one person interpreting the data one way versus 50 people interpreting that same data that way. I
Yeah.
think your epistemic position is stronger in the second case. It's still just it's still that same singular set of data,
Mhm.
but you have better reason to think that that data supports what they take it to, given that so many people have evaluated it in that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's one case where one sort of input or one set of data can be bolstered up by agreement. But the case, as you kind of first set it out, was a case where like everyone believes it because this one person believes it,
Yeah.
and that's the difference. So I think that would be a problem. So if everyone sort of, or everyone who believed that, say, God existed just believed it because this original person believed it, and everyone
Mm.
else just kind of believes it on their say so, then I think the numbers matter, or matter a lot less, because they're not independent. So one sort of issue that both the disagreement literature and the common consent argument have to deal with is the independence of opinion, and that's a tricky, thorny issue.
Mm.
So you could think of an analogous case with, say, with climate change. There's 90% plus climate scientists believe that climate change is happening. So that sort of agreement is taken, and I think rightly, to give us good reason to believe that the climate's changing.
Mhm.
Now, if it turns out that all those climate scientists just believe that because there's one sort of like, I don't know, the mega original climate
Right.
scientist, and they're just believing it because that person thought so, well, then the agreement among the climate scientists would count for way less.
Yeah.
So I do think the independence of the opinions matters. The more independent they are, the better the strength of the evidence.
Okay.
But how exactly we should think about independence, I think, is tricky and hard, because using the climate scientist example again, it's not that all those climate scientists are working in complete isolation from each other, right?
Right.
They're still using each other's work and referencing each other's studies, so they aren't completely independent. But that sort of independence seems not problematic.
Yeah.
How exactly we sort of make a principal distinction there, I think, is a tough thorny issue. But I think we can point to at least clear cases of where independence is harmful, and when it's not.
Okay. So one thing I've learned as I've been studying philosophy is the utility of Sorites paradoxes, where you can just bring them in all over the place. It's kind of like a shortcut for a lot of thinking. But this is common consent, and so like, how do we determine what's common? Is it 51%, or is there an actual point, or is it a vague kind of, maybe over 80%, and then we can have more evidence, but it doesn't count if it's 83% or something? What do you make of that?
Yeah, good. I think it's a tricky issue. Um, and I mean, I would have thought. So here would be my initial thought that I don't think is right, but I would have thought that, like, 50% is an important threshold, that over 50% something important changes, and then the higher it goes, things get better.
Mhm.
I'm kind of now starting to think that even less than 50% could be an important difference. So
Hmm.
like the analogy I use in the paper is with recycling beliefs, right?
Yeah, it's
So,
great. Mm-hmm.
the way I far too often come to believe that today is recycling pickup day is by seeing my neighbors recycling out already.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about that case, does there have to be 50% of my neighbors that have their recycling out in order for me to believe it's recycling day? And I don't think so in that case. So obviously, if it's just one kind of neighbor, I'm not going to get too concerned or think it's recycling day. But it seems like the number can be short of 50%, and it still be sort of like the best explanation of that belief is that it's true that today is recycling day.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what might be doing the work more than the actual numbers is thinking about what the best explanation is for the data that we're seeing. And so if the data is just say 40% agreement amongst whatever else, the best explanation of that could be the truth of that belief.
Yeah.
And I think if that's the case, then that agreement would serve as an evidential basis or a good reason to have that belief.
That's such a good point, and I do really like the recycling analogy because I'm the same way. I have a pretty long stretch to get to my house, and it's just houses on one side, and it's just if you're there's no real need unless you live there to go down this way because it's kind of a dead end, and so like I'll go past and see everyone's recycling out, and sometimes it's not recycling day, but some of them are forgotten they brought it out, and I wonder if there's if there's a again, epistemology is so hard. If there's a distinction between like being good evidence and being rational to believe, like if I see one or two of them, it might be rational for me to be like, oh yeah, today must be Thursday because garbage day is on Friday and they put it out the night before. But then if I keep going and I don't see anyone else, yeah, maybe that belief was rational, but now it doesn't serve as like good evidence. I have better evidence that, if we're doing inference to the best explanation, that those two were mistaken and it was a holiday. And so it's actually not Friday, but it's going to be Saturday. Is there a distinction between like rational versus like rational is like base level? Like it's rational. You can believe it. It's you aren't flouting your epistemic duties, but it's not great evidence.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I hate the word rational, because in part because it can be used in so many different ways.
Sure.
So I think there's a sense in rational where we just kind of mean like that's not crazy, right? So
Yes. Right.
if we think about and I think of the analogy with like sports predictions, right? So you can predict who's gonna win the Super Bowl next year, and lots of those predictions could be rational, but none of them are like more reasonable than not, or the evidence on balance supports. It's just like, well, that's not ludicrous. Whereas if you
Yeah.
said like the Jaguars will win the Super Bowl, that would be ridiculous, and you would lose your airtime, and you wouldn't get to defend your case.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's like a sense of rational that's well below even supported by the evidence.
Okay.
So I think the sense of rational, I'm an evidentialist, so I think the sense of rational that epistemologists typically care about just is tied to supported by your evidence.
Okay.
So in the cases you were describing it, I mean, the way I would unpack that is when you see those first couple recycling bins, at that point, your evidence strongly supports, let's say, believing that it's recycling day. And then as you keep going, you're adding to that stockpile of evidence, and you're getting more and more evidence that's sort of going against your original belief. And so I think as you're going, it changes what it's rational for you to believe, but it changes because of your evidential situation has changed, right? The original evidence still supports what it supported,
Yeah.
but now it's just sort of outweighed or counterbalanced by stronger evidence to the other side.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good. So just as an aside here, um, do you take a side on internalism, externalist? Are you an internalist as well as an evidentialist, or
In epistemology, yeah, I'm definitely an internalist.
okay? Well,
Yeah.
everyone, clutch your pearls. That might be evidence of evidence. No, I recently come to consider myself more of an internalist as well. So that's cool. That's cool to hear. I'm sure some people listening would be really interested in that. Hopefully, they don't discount the externalists. Don't discount the rest of what you say because of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one interjection. So one thing that I like about the disagreement literature, I haven't thought about if it applies as much to the agreement part of it. But what's nice about the disagreement literature is whether you're an internalist or an externalist about what provides justification for your beliefs, I think what the disagreement literature shows is that discovering a disagreement gives you a defeater for that justification, or it
Yeah.
takes it away.
Yeah.
And so, even if you're an externalist about what provides justification, um, almost all externalists still leave room for defeaters, for evidence to kind of take it away. And so, I
Yeah.
think the disagreement, what's appealing about the disagreement debate is you don't have to be an internalist or an externalist to kind of feel the pull of the problem there, because if it's a defeater for whether you're an internalist or an externalist.
Yeah.
I'm not
That's a
sure
good
that
point.
carries over to the agreement part, because there we're looking for like positive positive justification.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know if an externalist can give the sort of same spin. But I mean, it is kind of funny, I think, how often externals still do want to talk about evidence and evidence mattering. So it's not like if you're an externalist, you suddenly cease thinking or caring about evidence altogether. So I think
Right.
even there, externalists should be, have open ears and
Yeah,
be
that's
okay
right.
here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, okay, so you another way to couch the argument is human opinions provide good evidence for God. But you make this distinction. It doesn't like establish his existence. Not because everyone has this opinion that God exists, therefore he exists. Despite maybe what Jordan Peterson might say, or someone following like in that school of thought. No, we're couching that. It's just that this is evidence that God does exist. And you say, look, this is an epistemological argument, not a metaphysical argument. And
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what brought up the rational. Is it a rational belief type thing? Uh, this kind of carries over from I used to be really hardcore into transcendental arguments and trying to make one work because I thought they were so cool. And then Barry Stroud kind of slapped me over the head and stuff. And um, there's like this distinction between a conceptual transcendental argument and a world directed one. Whether this just tells you about what you must think versus telling you about reality in and of itself. And it's kind of like turning Kant against Kant himself.
Sure.
And I wonder if that kind of distinction follows into this argument as well. And someone might say, well, look, yeah, great. This gives you positive evidence in an epistemological fashion, but it doesn't really tell you about the nature of reality because you can't. You're trying to bridge this epistemological gap into metaphysics, but that's not the type of argument. Well, how do you respond to that type of? I guess it's like a
Yeah.
Kantian claim or something, right?
Yeah. Good. I mean, there's a lot there. So I mean, I think first of all, like you know, the arguments like this strike many people as just being fallacious and bad, right?
Yeah.
So often this kind of argument's used as an example of like the bandwagon fallacy, where it's like where the idea there, I think, is this sort of confusion. Like, well, just because some people believe it doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't follow that it's got to be true. It could still be false.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, I mean, because your evidence never, or at least very rarely, guarantees or entails the truth of the thing that it's evidence for. Um, so that's where I think the fallacy sort of issue kind of is misunderstanding what's going on with these sorts of arguments or cases. So I do think what's at issue is what is it rational for us to believe, but that's not entirely divorced from what's true, because what it's rational to believe, it's what it's rational to believe is true. So
Yeah.
it's not making anything true, for sure. The world is the way that the world is,
Mhm.
and I mean, the way I think we're just doing our best with the information we have to get our best sort of like cognitive map of what the world actually is, and the best way to do that is to follow our evidence.
Yeah.
And our evidence is still fallible. It's not, it's incomplete, it's imperfect, and it doesn't guarantee that the world matches the way it indicates. But we can't do any better in terms of getting at the world, I think, than following what our evidence says. So I mean, that's where I think our goal in being good believers is to follow our evidence, right, and
Yeah.
believe in accordance with our evidence. And if the world ends up not being that way, well then, okay, I mean, okay, well, what else could we have done? than go with the way with what our evidence suggests.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. That's really helpful. One thing that I was thinking of when I first came upon like Feldman and this type of stuff was if um it's contested, I think, when people started thinking the earth is round instead of flat, and it some people say, look, we can go all the way back. People thought the earth was a sphere or whatever. So whatever the case, let's say in like 500 AD or something, let's say like most people thought it was flat, and I come to believe that it's round, like like it is now. You know, it's not perfect sphere,
Okay.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I came to believe that. But everyone else thinks it's flat. I have this true belief. Um, I I guess we'd have to talk about like the how I discovered that or something for it to be justified. But I don't know. Can we stipulate that it's justified? Maybe. Would the would it be rational? Sorry to bring you back to that rational stuff, but would it be rational for me to believe that, even though all of my peers say that I'm wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think in most ways of filling that out, the answer is no. So,
Okay.
um, in part because of what I take to be the epistemic significance of disagreement, right? So,
Yeah.
when there's this very powerful evidence, which is like scientific consensus against you.
Mhm.
Now, in that case, it was misleading evidence, and so you had the truth. Um, but you can have a true belief and not be rational, and you can have
Right.
a rational belief and it not be true,
Yeah.
right? So what I would say in the flat Earth cases, those people back then were believing exactly as they should. They were being rational. They were following their evidence. Their evidence misled them, and we have better evidence, and we're in a better situation now. But they still had rational beliefs. I mean,
Yeah.
so what one kind of I think what you're hinting at is the one kind of tricky part is like how does this maybe goes back to the Sorites series too, is how does that then shift, right? So if you have this sort of like consensus
Right.
scientific opinion, and then someone comes around and starts out as an outlier, I think their beliefs kind of aren't justified. Their interpretation or their way of seeing the evidence isn't justified then, because it goes against the consensus opinion. But at some point, it becomes justified, right? Because now
Yeah.
we're all justified in believing that the Earth's roughly spherical.
Right.
When exactly did that happen? Did it have to? At what? When did the scale sort of tip over? I think those are kind of tough questions. But one thing I would just at least say is that even though I guess you're the spherical discoverer in this case. So
Yeah.
even though I think you're not justified in your belief, I think you're still rational in carrying out your research program. It's still a good thing for you to be defending
Ah.
your
Okay.
belief, to
Okay.
be making the case for your belief, trying to convince other people. So that project, I think, is still a rational project for you
Yeah.
to take on, even if your belief that you're correct isn't justified for you.
Yeah, that's good, man. So I'm taking a philosophy of science class right now, and I think maybe Lakatosh talks about that with like it's like yeah, keep on with the scientific project, even if maybe Popper talks about that too. Like okay, yeah, that's really good. So I think one more thing that would really help me here is if have you seen the old Willy Wonka movie?
I've at least seen lots of it. I
Okay,
don't know if I've
okay,
ever seen the whole thing the whole way through, but
okay.
I've seen long parts of it.
Well, spoiler alert. At the end, Wonka gives the factory to Charlie, and they fly up through this elevator, and it's like it turns out it can fly through the sky roof and stuff, and it's flying all around London or wherever they're at. Um, and I just want to like think about if that let's say that's a time machine. So it's a sorry to
Okay,
make this all stupid and
that's
complicated,
all
but
right.
it's an elevator that can go all around, it can fly, and let's say it's a time machine. Someone goes back in time, I'm in 500 AD, grabs me and just shoots me up with them all the way up into the stratosphere or whatever, and I can see that the Earth is round now. And then they just zoom me all the way back down. Um, how does that evidence that I just experienced for myself, like first person, qualia stuff, how does that compare with the consensus of all my peers? Is that stronger evidence? Do you know how we might go about adjudicating or weighing those two?
Yeah, good. Um, I mean, I'd hesitate to make sort of any sort of principled claim in terms of like evidence like this
Okay.
always beats evidence like that.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I consider myself like a kind of particularist there. Like
Sure. Yeah.
how the
Good.
evidence adds up kind of depends about the particular evidence in that specific case. And so I wouldn't want to say that like personal experience evidence always trumps consensus evidence
Okay.
or vice versa. In that case, I do think you have very powerful evidence, and you have good reason to think that no one else around you has that same evidence, right?
Yeah.
And so I think in a case like that, you would have reason to go against the consensus because you have good reason to think that you are in a much superior epistemic position than they are,
Yeah.
because you have access to this information that they don't.
And we
You know,
have
in
like
this
a error theory for them too. Like they didn't lie up.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and a
Gotcha.
justified error theory. It's not just like we're not like we're just. It's not just possible that they're lacking this thing. We have good reason to think that they are.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, this is awesome. This has been really helpful with my own thought here. So let's jump into the argument a little bit more.
Okay.
I just I pulled like four of the premises. So maybe I'll just read those. Kind of hard to do this in a podcast, but well, let's do it. So premise one: the belief that God exists is very prevalent. Premise two: God existing is a good explanation for the prevalence of the belief that God exists. Premise three: God existing better explains the prevalence of the belief that God exists than any available rival explanation. And then premise four: therefore, God exists. Um, that's good. I like that. Do you remember off the top of your head or the recycling case, how we might compare and contrast the recycling versus this one?
Yeah, good. So, I think the general. I stole this format from from a couple of my epistemology friends who are inference to the best explanation experts. So the idea here is like this is just a kind of basic core formulation of any sort of inference to the best explanation. So
Yeah.
you have some data, in this case, the belief that God exists, or it could be the belief that the recycling is today, and that's in both cases prevalent. Um, and then the second premise says that the truth of that belief is the best explanation, or is a good explanation of the prevalence of that belief, right? And then premise three adds that there isn't a better explanation. So there's this data, we have a good explanation for why it's the case. There isn't a better explanation for it. So it's the best explanation and it's a good explanation. And so the rational thing for us to believe is the truth of the belief. So God exists or that the recycling is today. So just to go back to the recycling ones, like,
Yeah.
um, I go out and I see all my neighbors recycling. So I come to believe that most of my neighbors believe that the recycling is today. I think to myself, why might they believe that? Well, one explanation is that the recycling is today, and that'd be a pretty good explanation for why they all believe it.
Yeah.
It's not the only explanation, right? It could be that they were all, given some deceitful letter by the HOA talking about some recycling change, or it could be that someone kind of went around and took out their recycling bins against their will.
Yeah.
But those are all possible, but they aren't nearly as good of an explanation for why they believe it. And so, given that, I think it's rational for me to conclude that the recycling is today. Again, it's not a guarantee. I could still be wrong,
Yeah.
but it's rational for me to believe it.
Okay. Yeah. And this you've said that this argument is bolstered by the new or the new developments in like higher order evidence and even thinking about the wisdom of groups, evidence of evidence being evidence and all that good stuff. Um, what does this depend on thinking that most people are like decent reasoners or decent knowers? Like if you had this idea that most people are dumb,
Yeah,
would that change how the argument should affect you?
yeah, definitely. So, I mean, if people got it wrong more often than they got it right, that would be a big problem.
Okay.
So yeah, part of the background here is that while people are still biased people and they still have their cognitive flaws, um, we still do pretty good, right? In terms of getting to true beliefs, we still do all right. We still hit on things, roughly accurately. Now that's one way to kind of resist the argument, um, is that while we get things right regarding, say, recycling beliefs and things like that, our track record regarding you know deep philosophical truths like whether God exists might be a lot worse. And
Yeah.
so um, I think that's a powerful objection to the argument that maybe regarding matters like this, we don't sort of meet that condition that as individuals we're at least better than 50% at getting it right.
Okay. Yeah. So how do we think about how would we analyze that? Like, how would we evaluate how good people are at thinking
Yeah,
God thoughts?
yeah, good. I mean, I think it's a hard question, and it's hard to evaluate without sort of like presupposing the answer. So like, how good we are regarding our um, God's existence beliefs depends on whether God exists, right?
Right.
So if
Right.
God exists and lots of people believe it, then okay, we're pretty good at it. But if God doesn't exist,
Yeah.
then we're pretty bad at it. So it's kind of hard, to make a compelling case there. I think one way or the other is kind of satisfying to people on the other side.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned planning earlier and his warranted Christian belief stuff. He makes this he at the outset he's like, look, there's two objections, the de
Yeah,
facto and de jure. And he's saying like, I'm after the de jure. Like, this is rational to believe if God is existent. If God exists, then it's okay. If not, then it changes. And so I wonder if that's analogous to what we're talking about here as well.
yeah, good. I can see that connection. That's a nice connection. So I do see that the case might be sort of bolstered if we also assume that it's true that God exists, because then we might be able to build more into our reliability or our goodness at evaluating evidence for God's existence.
Yeah.
Um, to play the other side, so I mean, one sort of, I guess, worry I have with the argument. I mean, I should say first, like, I wouldn't say that I'm like a supporter of the argument. So I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's a super interesting argument, and it's
Hmm.
definitely shortchanged. So it deserves more credit than it's given. But I wouldn't call myself an endorser of the argument. I like thinking about it, but I wouldn't say that it actually succeeds. I think there's enough sort of worries in the neighborhood, and this is one of the worries having to do with how reliable or how good we are at forming beliefs like this. So
Mm.
even if we assume God exists, and so the fact that most people believe it shows that we're kind of reliable along that line. There's so much religious disagreement
Yeah.
on related issues, so about what God is like, or various other religious claims or philosophical claims. I think more generally, that gives us a good reason to sort of question how good we are at figuring out things like this.
Yeah.
So I think there's a pretty strong reason there to think that maybe we aren't more accurate than not when it comes to either religious things or philosophical things more generally.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I actually like that you aren't the gung ho, like this is the end all, because it seems like you're just like, hey, let's just bolster this argument. Let's just see like how far this goes. And most people are like, that's bandwagon. You write it off in your intro to philosophy class. And is it? Let's see. Let's do some hard work. I love that kind
Yeah.
of philosophy. Some people might think, well, that's sophistry. And it's like, well, I think more sophistry just to write it off
Yeah,
without giving it
exactly.
its proper due.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I mean, what I at least mentioned before is I think what's fascinating to me is how many issues kind of bump up against the common consent argument. So
Yeah.
there's issues about divine hiddenness. There's issues about higher order evidence and the wisdoms of the crowd. There's issues about cognitive science of religion. There's
Right.
issues. There's all these sort of like hot button issues, all kind of intersect with the common consent argument in ways that I think they don't regarding like the cosmological argument or the
Mm.
ontological argument. So I think that's an additional reason I think to be a little more interested in this argument, is because it lets you also think alongside all these other interesting issues in the philosophy of religion.
Yeah, so something I think that's right, and to keep going on that theme, I just kind of discovered the pro-theism, anti-theism debates of like, should you want God to exist or should you not want God
Mm,
to exist? Couching, setting aside whether he does or not. And I thought this might have some implications there as well. Like if you might be a pro-theist and think you're a pro-theist because you want common consent not to disprove the rationality of humanity. Like if 80% or 90% of human beings believe in God, and like you should maybe you don't want everyone to be idiots. Maybe that's a consideration that you go into your theorizing. Like, I kind of want there to be a God so that not everyone's dumb.
yeah, interesting. So you took me for a turn I wasn't expecting you to go. I thought you were going to say maybe the reason why so many people believe God exists is because they want God to exist, right?
Oh
So
yeah,
that's a possible sort of like debunking explanation
yeah,
against
wish
the common
fulfillment
consent
kind of
argument.
thing,
But yeah,
right?
you kind of turn it the other way around, maybe we want the God to exist so that we have this better view about human rationality, which is interesting. I like that.
Well, I've been talking to too many epistemologists, I think, and they're like,
Not possible.
that's awesome. Well, I used to have a much harder view on like people who didn't study philosophy, I guess, because I studied it and I thought I was awesome. And one of my epistemologist friends studying at Northwestern to get his PhD in epistemology or an emphasis there, and he's like, "Look, dude, I think people aren't as dumb as sometimes we think in philosophy classes. Like I want to think that yeah, generally speaking, like we can use inductive inferences and come to pretty good conclusions. I don't want to think everyone's dumb. Hearing him say that kind of changed my mind. So that's what made me think like, yeah, I
I
don't
see.
want everyone to be an idiot, I think.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
another related thing that came up for me was in the God conversation. Sometimes my atheist friends or agnostic friends they'll look at like the argument for God from so many arguments type view, and they say, look, cumulative case of a cumulative case, right? Like all these
yeah,
arguments, and they say, look, these have different conclusions. Some are for classical theistic God, some are for neoclassical, some are for Aristotle's thinking thought or whatever. And I thought this brings in this argument. Another thing it bumps on is like rigid designators and definite descriptions. Like when you say God, if you have like this rigid designator, then okay, it's just whatever entity all these things are referring to. And maybe John Hick comes in and says, yeah, it's the greater, like impersonal reality, whatever. But if you have like a definite description, then maybe even like the God of Calvinism is different than Arminianism, is different than open theism, and then your models might be different too. So I just thought that that's another area of another emphasis that this brings in, sucks in, and you have to get clear on all this stuff. It's really fun to think through because of one argument here.
yeah. No, definitely. I mean, I didn't even touch on that issue, but that's a good one too. I mean, that gets seen a little bit in terms of it's really hard, I think, to find good data about how prevalent theistic belief is. In part because it's really hard to get clear on that question, right? To make sure we're all talking about the same thing, not
Right.
talking past each other. And even a lot of the data is about whether you are, part of some religious tradition or something. Where
Right.
it leaves open, you can be part of that tradition without having this belief. That's a possibility there too.
Oh yeah.
So I think it's a hard thing to get precise on. Though I do think there's enough information that sort of like does lend good credence to the idea that the belief that I mean, I think the more general you make it, the stronger the case is going to be, right? So
Right.
that there's a divine being is going to get a lot more common consent than there's a being that's omniscient, omnipotent, and wholly good, which
Yeah.
is a narrower one. But even that one still, I think, is gonna have there's a pretty um, big group of people that are on board there.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. One cool fact that I grabbed. There's a lot of cool facts, but one that was just kind of random was, um, you mentioned Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and this
Yeah.
was nuts to me. The audience poll did much better. It was a much better strategy to go with the audience than to call an expert friend, and it was like 95% to 65%. And it just kind of shows, which man, I don't know. I still have to think about this more because I don't trust crowds really,
I
but
know.
it shows like the crowd was a better choice than
Yeah.
an expert.
There's another example that's really good. That one's really great. I don't think I put this one in the paper, but there's another famous experiment where I think it's counting jelly beans in a jar,
Oh yeah,
and so
I think you
everyone
did put this one.
did I put it in
Yeah,
there? Okay,
I
so
think so.
everyone gives their guess of how many jelly beans are in the jar, and the average response did better than all but one of the
All but one.
individual guesses.
Yeah,
So
crazy.
yeah, it's that sort of social psychology stuff is really fascinating to me. I've only really sort of like began dipping my toe into those waters, but
Yeah,
it's definitely interesting. And it does go to show that the crowds have a lot more going for them
yeah,
than we often give them credit for.
yeah, yeah. Well, so you've said like this isn't. You were approached to make this to write this argument up in the way that you did. So it's not. Yeah, it's not like you did your dissertation on it and you want to. Your whole livelihood is staked on it. But do you find a significant difference between what we hear as the informal, bandwagon fallacy versus common consent? Is there like significant difference in what would that be if there is?
I mean, I don't know that there. I mean, the only I don't know. I really hate informal fallacies.
Okay.
I think they're dangerous, and we shouldn't. I think we shouldn't be teaching them because I think it just equips people to just quickly label and dismiss arguments or reasons or people without giving them their sufficient due.
Sure.
And I think often where there's a fallacy, there's something true and good in the neighborhood, right? That's why it became a fallacy. If it was just a terrible way to think, it
Yeah.
wouldn't have caught on to be a popular way of kind of going bad. So there has to, I think, there's often something sort of true or a good way to reason in the neighborhood, and I think that's the case here. I mean, I think the whenever I see the bandwagon fallacy sort of discussed or why it's a problem, it's always this sort of refrain of, well, just because the group thinks so, it doesn't mean that it's true. The group could be wrong, which, of course the group could be wrong. So I mean,
Right.
I don't think anyone should think as long as the group says so, I definitely have a true belief. So I think if that's what the fallacy is being sort of like certain or thinking that the group somehow makes the conclusion true, that's a mistake. But I think that's not typically what's going on.
Hmm.
Usually it's this more modest claim of, well, going with what the group says can be really good evidence to think that something's true. Again, it's not infallible, it's not perfect, doesn't make your conclusion certain,
Yeah.
but it's what we have to go on.
Yeah. So that's actually really similar to what my friend said when we were talking about informal fallacies, and he was like, "Yeah, like there is a good, yeah, exactly what you said. There's a good line of reasoning close within the proximity. Otherwise, so many people wouldn't do it." And I think you make a good point about that too, about like because people often say like begging the question and they hardly ever use it in the right way. Well, that begs the question. You're like, that's
Right.
not quite,
Yeah.
but even like begging the question, the real way to do it, it's an informal fallacy, and some epistemologists are like, hey, look, there's some times where epistemic circularity is justified, maybe, and
Yeah.
you can defend it at least, even if you think it's wrong.
Yeah. No, I mean that's where, I mean, I'm of the school like, look, put the argument, number the premises,
Mm,
number the conclusion, and then if you want to object to it, you have two ways to do it. Either one of those conclusions isn't reasonable or one of the premises isn't reasonable to believe, or the conclusion doesn't follow. So those are your two ways to dismiss the argument. And I think all the informal fallacies and labeling and just kind of get in the way, or they're like a lazy way of
right.
actually addressing the argument. Well, which premise are we rejecting then? Which one's false, or
Yeah.
why does the conclusion not follow? You should be able to, I think, give the objection in one of those ways. And I think the informal fallacy is just distracting window dressing. I'd say it's a red herring, but then I'd be doing the very thing that I don't that I'm
That's
saying
awesome.
not to do.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I discovered this because wanted the shortcut. I wanted to cheat. Like I wanted to be able to. I'll memorize the Latin because that'll make me sound smart,
Exactly.
and then
Yeah.
petitio, princip, whatever. Um, but yeah, the problem was I was studying maybe more debate books too than like straight up logic books, but I would tell someone, "Hey, look, man, that's a red herring," or "You're big," and they didn't know enough logic
Yeah,
to say, "Why is that a
exactly.
problem?" And I wouldn't be able to explain it to them, and then I looked like the idiot because
Oh, see,
I couldn't even explain it to them why that was an error.
yeah. See, I usually see it the other way around, where it's a kind of more of like an intellectual bullying, where you're just like,
Yeah.
"That's a red herring," or "That's an ad hominem," and then your interlocutor's like, "I don't know what to do with that, so I'm just disengaging, or I'm
Yeah.
walking away, or I'm just
Yeah.
conceding that I'm making some mistake that I don't really understand."
Yeah.
And so it's not you're not furthering fruitful dialogue. You're
Right.
just alienating your
Yeah.
interlocutor. So
Well, that's what I was doing, and
yeah,
every now and then someone was smart enough to be like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" Or "Why is that a problem?" I'm like, "Crap, dude. Well, 'cause that's what we're supposed to you're supposed to think that's a problem."
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, man.
That's
That's
another
just
ad hominem.
that's
You
right. That's
just
right.
double down.
Yeah, abusive at yeah, right. Circumstantial. Yeah, okay. So you bring up you talked in your objections, you brought in even more, and you said, "Look, there's even more connections in Phil religion type arguments lately." So you brought in like hiddenness. How does hiddenness relate to common consent?
Good. So the common consent argument is, kind of it's datum that it's kind of working with us. Look how prevalent theistic belief is, which is kind of, in some sense funny given the problem of divine hiddenness, because the problem of divine hiddenness says, well, if God really existed, everyone would believe it, or at least many more people would believe it. There would
Right.
be no irrational, non-culpable lack of belief.
Hmm.
Anyone who didn't believe would either be irrational or blameworthy for not believing. So if God existed, we shouldn't expect there to be, you know, 70, 80% of people believe in God. We should expect there to be, 99 or 100, 100%.
Right.
So that the actual numbers count against God's existence rather than for God's existence.
Hmm.
It would be the angle of divine hiddenness. And I think the problem of divine hiddenness is obviously it's a good thorny philosophical problem. Um, but it's not clear to me what we should think both about it and how we should think of it in terms of this argument. So
Yeah.
I guess the main thing I think here is that even if we should expect there to be more theistic belief than there is if God really existed, it still could be that there's a lot more theistic belief than we should expect if God didn't exist. And so it still could kind of push us to the explanation that God exists. So the analogy that I use in the paper, and it's one that I talked with Thomas Bogaris, actually, I think
Huh.
helped equip me with this one. But imagine, you hire a gardener to take care of the weeds in your yard, and you go away for a vacation, you come back, and given that you hired a gardener, you expect there to be next to no weeds in your yard. It turns out there's still, let's say, like 10% of the weeds or 20% of the weeds. That's more. It's a lot more weeds than you would expect,
Yeah.
but it's still a lot less weeds than you'd expect if the gardener hadn't been there at all,
Ah, yeah.
right? So, what best explains that there are 20% of the weeds in your yard? That the gardener was there,
Mm.
right? You still would want less, and you should still expect less, but it still points to the gardener having been there as opposed to pointing to the gardener not having been there.
Yeah.
So I think the relevant thing to do in the hiddenness is to kind of have these two contrasting points, which is how much belief should we expect if God existed, and how much belief should we expect if God didn't exist, and then both of those are really hard to figure out too. So
Yeah.
but
Right.
that's it. They're both hard to figure out. And then what matters, I think, is the contrastive claim about which one of those better fits the distribution of opinion that we actually have in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. And to go back to the analogy of the gardener, well, at least with Schellenberg, he is baking in the quality of the gardener, right? And it's like, eh, is this evidence that there was a good gardener here? Because, like, yeah, maybe 20% would be like, that's a bad gardener would miss 20% of the weeds, but not a good gardener. And so you're like, well, let's just talk about a gardener. And then if you want to go into the character, now we'd have to say, well, what about a really good gardener who knows that if he poisoned one weed and left it, then it would spread to the other weeds, and actually leaving 20% is a really good method. if you're an amazing gardener. So maybe you have evidence
Yeah.
against a bad gardener, a good. And so now we're back to the character of God, instead of saying, let's just look at, or the character of the gardener. Let's just look at the existence of a gardener and going a step back. So
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I don't think that whatever we think about the common consent argument is going to solve the problem of divine hiddenness. I mean, I think
yeah,
no
right.
matter what you think about the common consent argument, you're still going to want to have something to say
Yeah,
about
sure.
why theistic belief isn't more prevalent.
Hmm.
But I do think there is this sort of at least defense of the common consent argument from the problem of divine hiddenness, which is like, even though that's still a problem and we haven't
Yeah,
said anything to like solve that, there's at least a reason, I think, to prevent it from blocking this argument at least
yeah.
entirely.
That's really cool. There's kind of like a dialectic of like, yeah, you start with hiddenness and then you get over to common consent, and now we can go into the nature and character of God, and up and up and up we go. It's kind of
Yeah,
cool.
I mean that's another one of those ways where there's so many things just kind of connect to this argument, which I didn't think of or see ahead of time, which is like, as the more I looked into, it's like, oh look, there's a connection to this, there's a connection to that,
Yeah.
which is really kind of fun.
Yeah. Well, we've already talked a little bit about debunking arguments, but yeah, what do you make about yeah, wish fulfillment, and like Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, the three horsemen or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly not an expert there. I mean, I think the most I've really read or engaged in those debates was going back to the Plantinga book and his sort of deal with it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are kind of hard issues coming from cognitive science. I do think probably the most pressing one are the more evolutionary arguments to deal with, um, you know, cognitive cognitive mechanisms in us that are sort of that have been adaptive, that also sort of train us to look for agency where there perhaps isn't agency.
Hmm.
And so it could be that belief in God is better explained as a byproduct of these adaptive cognitive faculties. I mean, I think there's a interesting hard argument there. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of evolutionary debunking arguments regarding not just theistic belief, but ethical beliefs,
Yeah.
moral beliefs, philosophical beliefs. Um, I'm not convinced that they work, but I do think that they're difficult challenges there.
And that's like the hyperactive agency detective device, right? Like
Yeah, I
it
think that's right. HADD.
had or
You
something like,
had,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. We look for, and when I first heard that one, it really freaked me out. I think I heard about it when I was in undergrad, and then other guys like Tyler McNabb will be like, "Well, that's good, man. If God existed, of course he'd put that in us. He'd want us to recognize agency and stuff like that. What kind of God would not do that?" And I was like, "Oh, so it comes to interpretation again."
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on, how active I think we want to think of this device, right? So I mean,
Yeah,
obviously, the kinds of cases that get used, like obviously it can go more like, so if you hear a rustling in a bush, it could be the wind or it could be a predator. So you're better off thinking it's a predator because you're not going to be eaten.
right.
Whereas you're wrong once and you're dead. You're dinner. So
Yeah.
um, how often this is, now I'm going to talk more externalist like, but how reliable this process is might matter, at least for externalists. Um, the other sort of like response that I like to this concern is thinking about I guess two things. One being the persistence of theistic belief. So it's one thing to think about how
Hmm.
a belief came to be, and it's another thing to think about how the belief kind of stuck around. So even if beliefs kind of sort of came to be by a suspect mechanism, um, why did they not go away? So I mean, I think that gives us at least reason to think that there are one, either other faculties involved in our relevant beliefs, whether they be theistic beliefs or moral beliefs. So like, think of the moral parallel. Like maybe we believe these things about cooperation because of some evolutionary story,
Right.
but we still believe them and we've kept believing them. So maybe that's because we have other faculty, other rational faculties that also support these same
Oh, yeah.
conclusions.
Right.
And so what best explains why we continue to believe, as opposed to, it's going back to the bush analogy. So once you kind of you stop believing there's a predator in the bush eventually, right? If it just kind of keeps moving, or you get other reasons to think that it's just the wind, the belief that it's a predator goes away. It doesn't stick with you forever once it kind of gets into your head.
Yeah.
So I think there's a potential, at least, response there on behalf of the theist for why the evolutionary story doesn't at least totally debunk religious belief.
Okay. Yeah, I think inference to the best explanation is doing a lot of work, and I think that's good. And I like it. One thing that kind of freaked me out, which I think an epistemologist can help me with, is I read Peter Lipton's work a couple years back, and just he made this as an offhand comment about, like, by definition, the best explanation is not the true definition or explanation. Sorry, by definition, the best explanation is not the true explanation. It's just the best one out of all the rivals. And I just got this, like, weird skeptical thought of, like, well, then it doesn't, like, tell us truth. It tells us what's best, and there could be all these other options and stuff like that. And that's certainly been the case in history when we look back and we laugh at them now for thinking the Earth was, turtles all the way down or whatever. As an epistemologist, man, maybe you can help me out. We're just if we use inference to the best explanation to think that this is the true explanation for why the pizza is not in a refrigerator, like, that's justified, right? Like, we can say, like, that's good evidence for me to believe that, and so I can take that to be true, not just take it as if it's true, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I think if it didn't give you that, it wouldn't be doing what it needs to do, right? So
Yeah.
I think the whole point of an inference to the best explanation is to deliver a justified belief, to make you rational in believing the conclusion. I mean, I'll just kind of point out one other sort of objection that people have is, um, the best might not be so impressive if it's the best of a bad lot.
Totally.
So,
Yeah.
the best singer on American Idol might be still be a terrible singer, but they're the
Right.
best of that group. And so that's the reason I formulated the argument as I did in the paper, is to kind of build in. It's not just the best; it also has to be a good explanation.
Yeah.
So I think inferences the best explanation are only going to really work if it's not just the best, but also does a really good job. If you're the best explanation, but you're still a pretty crummy explanation, I think you're probably not going to be justified in believing it on that basis.
Yeah.
But in the case of, like, both the recycling belief and plausibly in the theistic belief case, a good explanation is that God exists, or that recycling comes out today.
Yeah, I think of I came home from a tournament once. I grew up wrestling. I wrestled throughout college, and I came back from one in middle school or something, and I told my dad, like, I got fourth place. He's like, "Oh, cool, man, good job. Like, out of how many?" And I was like, "Well, out of 5." And he's like, That's not as good, right? It's not that good. It's better than 5, I guess."
Yeah.
But when it comes to, I like that condition of being a good explanation, because if there's only a couple of really, like, terrible explanations, yeah, it's the best, but it's the best of the worst. Uh, what are some things we can use to, like, analyze good, like, or qualify something as a good explanation on top of the best?
Yeah, good. I mean, that's a hard question. So, I mean, I think one of the big debates around this issue is even just what counts as good making features of an explanation. And
Yeah.
so, there's a lot of literature on that, sort of what sort of theoretical virtues
Oh, yeah.
are there.
Simplicity
Like,
and all those good things.
exactly. So, I mean, I think it's not always kind of sort of clear cut.
Sure.
And there's some disagreement there, but yeah, things like simplicity are often cited. Things like explanatory power, things like coherence, sometimes fit with our background beliefs. So these are all sort of things that can be used as a kind of like metric for how good an explanation is. But again, there's not. I mean, I don't think there's any sort of nice, neat formula where you can just kind of like plug in the scores for a theory, and then it comes out as you know good, not good, or exactly how good it is. So a lot of that's going to be sort of our intuitive judgments there, and our I think there too it's going to depend on agreement and disagreement, people thinking about the different theories and what they come to think of their their sort of theoretical goodness.
Yeah. Okay. All the hardcore Bayesians are tearing their hair out right now.
I
We
know.
have a formula for this.
I know that was a kind of a veiled shot. You picked it out.
That's awesome. Well, John, this has been super helpful for me, man. I think you've I've been secretly using you to help me with this philosophy of science paper, which is really helpful on inference the best explanation. So it's genuinely helped me in major ways. But I appreciate the work you've done on this paper too, and representing common consent well, and doing a good job of um, introducing people to it, but bolstering a little bit, and then showing, hey, there's more work to be done. Someone can take this if you like this argument a lot. Like, there's much more that can be done and really cool stuff, especially to kind of trigger people who really hate it, and do it in a
Yeah.
way that is fun, so that you'll get them responding to you and with tons of notes, and now we get to elevate
Yeah.
the whole conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was kind of the motivation behind the project too, is, when you look at, collections, books or volumes on arguments for and against God's existence, very rarely does this argument get an appearance.
Yeah.
And so I think if we can think about it more, get more people thinking about it, then I think, given the argument, that's going to give us better reason, or it's going to enrich our evidential pool in terms of like what we should think about the issues that are sort of represented here.
Yeah. Well, I meant to wrap it up. I got one more for it because you just
Okay.
raised it. So let's say we take common consent and we're like, this provides evidence for the belief that God exists. And yet I am a philosophy of religion student, and most of my peers and even superiors think this is a bad argument. Um, does that do we have like who do I prioritize more? My peer group or the rest of the world?
So are you thinking of the case about their view about the argument itself?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they think the argument doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
so that's the last objection I consider in the paper. Like,
oh,
isn't
nice. Yeah.
isn't this argument self-defeating in this kind of interesting sense?
Okay.
Most people don't think it's a good argument.
Yeah.
So if we should sort of like believe in line with what most people think, then most people say this argument's a bad way to reason, and so we shouldn't follow the argument.
Yeah.
I think so. I think self-defeating objections are totally fascinating. Like they're fun to
Yes.
think about, and they
Yes.
and they make your head spin. I mean, they make
Totally.
my head spin. I do think it raises a good challenge. I mean, I do think that does raise a problem. But again, I think it parallels a problem just in the disagreement literature, right? Which is that if disagreement gives you, say, a reason to suspend judgment, well, people disagree about what you should do about disagreement, and so that view too sort of like reflects
Uh,
on itself and says, well, then ought you not give up your own view about disagreement? And so, I mean, I think in the disagreement case, the answer there too is yeah. So the
huh.
truth of the view gives you a reason not to hold the view, or makes
Holy
it
cow.
irrational for you to hold the view. And I think the same thing could be true here. The goodness of the argument could give you a reason not to believe the argument's a good argument. Um, so I think there's a sense in which it's self-defeating. That sense isn't showing that it's a bad way to reason. It's just showing that it would not be rational for you to
Right.
think it's a good way to reason.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. And that's a really good distinction because it's not self-refuting. It's not
Right.
necessarily false. It's just self-defeating, so that it might not be rational to believe, even if it is the case.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
awesome. Well, so it's funny that you were approached to do this chapter, and that you don't consider yourself like a super defender, because as I was reading this book, one of my friends, Chad McIntosh, a really good philosopher himself, he was writing a review of the book, and I asked him, what do you think are the best ones? And he said yours,
Oh wow. Okay.
William Lane Craig's, and then the ramified argument. I forgot what it is. Um, and so I just want to encourage you, man. Like, it
Awesome.
turned out to be, in at least one philosopher's opinion, one of the best in the entire book.
Cool. I appreciate that. That's humbling. There's a lot of good essays in that book.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's an amazing book. I recommend everyone saves up for the next couple years and then buys.
That's the thing. I hate the prices of these. I mean,
Yeah, Yeah, it
It's a
is what it
shame.
is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It'll come out in paperback like in a while or something, and everyone can afford it. Well, John, man, so if someone wants to continue on and reading some more of your stuff, do you got a website where they can follow up with you?
Yeah, I mean, anyone could email me. I'm happy to send out any papers, including this one. I mean, all my papers are up on the Phil Papers
Sweet.
database as well, so everything's there. But yeah, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to correspond with whoever and send a paper, or be happy to.
Awesome, man. This is huge. Well, I seriously appreciate you coming on and helping me grow as a thinker. That's going to have to do it for now, folks. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.